Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Shaw. I'm the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thank you for joining another installment of our Understanding Our New World series. And we're privileged today to be joined by Angelique Power, the president of the Field Foundation. Angelique is one of the most creative and innovative leaders in philanthropy. As a real dynamo, she has been the president of the Field Foundation for about 4 years. Prior to that, has had major jobs at the Joyce Foundation and other places that we will talk about. So Angelique, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, John. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I should mention that Angelique and I are both members of the board of director of a group called Forefront, which is a Chicago-based, Illinois-focused foundation that brings together the worlds of philanthropy, nonprofits, investors, and so forth. So Angelique is a youthful but steely veteran of the board. I'm a relatively new person, kind of learning the ropes. So I look forward to learning a lot in our conversation today. So Angelique, let's just start out a little bit with your background. I know you're from Chicago. Your mom was a school teacher. Your dad was a police officer. It sounds like the beginning of an interesting story. How did they meet, and how did you grow up in Chicago?
So thank you for even researching me and knowing that. I am really proud to be the daughter of a teacher and a police officer. They both have passed, but she was white and Jewish and he was Black. And when they met, she was working during the day as a teacher full-time, teaching high school English, and she was working full-time in the evenings as a police officer. They met during the blizzard that happened in '67, and they talked all night long. They were caught in the station and they talked all night long, and at the end of their shift, she gave him the phone book and said, "Look me up, give me a call sometime." And they started dating and married the following year in '68.
And then you grew up in, spent all of your life in Chicago. What part of town did you grow up in?
In Bronzeville and then in Hyde Park. I'm the youngest of 6. You're the youngest. You're the second
oldest
youngest.
of 6. Okay.
Second oldest. Okay. And so I do feel like we had great dinner table conversations. And I think that the perspectives of teachers and police officers are so valuable. They're often blamed for the systems that they are a part of, that they haven't solved the problems that the systems created. And so we had a lot of conversation around the city. I have a deep love and a deep skepticism for the city of Chicago. And I feel like I was sort of raised as a part of communities and apart from communities at the same time. So connectivity across perceived differences is a part of my DNA. And I also think that Bronzeville and Hyde Park have this cultural heritage and history that's extremely important to understanding the city of Chicago.
Well, as I read some of your writings, you write some wonderful letters to your board and friends of the Institute. So I looked at that at the website, and I was struck by this, as you say, this real, fascination with Chicago, this love of Chicago. But you also couple the concept of skepticism. Play out those different concepts and how you see the city of Chicago.
I think that we're living in a city that we interpret the things that happen in our current day as by happenstance, but anyone who's studied the city and reading all of the great books that your past speakers have recommended about Illinois and about Chicago, there are so many books written about the design of the city of Chicago. And so I think Chicagoans are incredible. I think that the art, the architecture, the expression of belief, the bare-knuckled grit of our city, the organizer spirit of our city is so inspiring, and I actually think that it leads the country. But I think that the intentional blindness to the exquisite design of inequity that also defines Chicago is something that we have to change if we want to reimagine how our city can function for everyone. So segregation isn't just by happenstance. Schools being shuttered in certain areas isn't, a quick decision. These are things where we've designed for some people to succeed and others to not succeed. And that's a very Chicago trait as well that deserves our skepticism, and the Chicagoans that live here merit our love.
Well, I want to go back to those, but let's go back to your background. You went from Chicago to the University of Michigan, where you studied, was it English?
Yes.
And then you went on, tell them about Michigan, and then you also went on to the Art Institute for an MFA.
Yeah, I always say that, I went to the University of Michigan, go Blue, and I loved my time in Ann Arbor. I felt like that was such an interesting space in the 90s. I'm showing my age now, but in the 90s when I went to college, where we were sort of playing out ideas in a safe space where protests and uprisings were sort of par for the course of life in Ann Arbor. I don't have an MBA to run a foundation, and instead I have an MFA. And I think that there's so many things that you gain from the arts. And I know your wife is an actor, but critical thinking and the ability to actually challenge the status quo is part of the DNA of any arts education, and why it's so critical to be included in our upbringing.
When you went to get the MFA, did you have a particular focus, or were you interested in arts administration? Was that where you wanted to take it?
No, I think most people go to art school to be artists and then come out in arts administration. But I don't call myself a writer anymore, but I, from a young age, always considered myself to be a writer. And so I actually went to the School of the Art Institute in '96. It was the very first year they established an MFA in writing program. And it was the only program in the United States for writing that took place in a visual arts setting instead of in a literary setting. And so you had the opportunity to have an interdisciplinary education. And I thought that was really interesting to be able to study, to write poetry and fiction, which is, I have a dual thesis, of minute fiction that's written about my ancestors and my family, and poetry that's written on a variety of topics. And you're a writer also.
I've written a number of books, so it's amazingly fun, also really hard work, and oftentimes when you're halfway through the project, you say, "Now, why did I start this out?" The inspiration is always there at the beginning, but it can be a bit of a grind to actually.
Yeah, no, writing is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Writing is fun. Revising is terrible, is what I
That's
should.
right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, one of my favorite historians, Barbara Tuchman, says, she said, "Research is endlessly seductive. Writing is hard work."
Yeah.
And I think that's true. But during your MFA, you had the good fortune to have a summer job, as I understand it, at Marshall Fields, and then that led to a whole range of possibilities. Talk to us about that.
Okay, first of all, John, I am so impressed that you know this much about my life. Like, it's tripping me out a little bit, actually. So Marshall Fields, when I started in '96 at the School of the Art Institute, a friend of mine was actually working at Marshall Fields and about to leave her job. So it was one of those things where she was a part-time assistant, and she sort of said, "Do you want to interview for my old job?" And so I did, and it was my first exposure. I mean, everyone in Chicago grew up going to Marshall Fields and having this sort of iconic experience. I'd never really worked for a corporation before, and I was fascinated by it. So this was in public affairs. I was a part-time assistant helping to put myself through grad school. And it was the first time I was exposed to an entity that was giving money away, that was giving shopping bags away and Frango mints and gift bags for different events around town. And it was the first time I learned about what it meant, what philanthropy meant on behalf of a company. But it was also the beginning of what would be a later poetic return to an entity that was giving money away with the Field name attached to it. At that time, Marshall Fields, though, was no longer owned by the Field family. That had shifted a while previous to that, and it was owned by Target Corporation. And so actually, I worked for 2 years while I was in graduate school. One of my favorite stories is actually about making copies of the grant proposals that Marshall Fields, that the folks were reviewing, and putting Post-it notes on top of the copies and turning them into my boss with my recommendations of whether these organizations should receive funding or not, which could have gone either way, you know. And I say that was like pre-millennial, because that's very millennial to sort of take ownership of ideas and your own voice in a space. But my boss, who is still actually at Target Corporation, Laisha Ward, called me in and challenged me on my Post-its and challenged me on the finances and the site visits, and became my first mentor. And so I spent 8 years in total with Target Corporation.
Right. Well, then how did you make the move to the Museum of Contemporary Art then? Was that, how did that happen?
Well, at that point, after graduating from SAIC, I received an offer to work full-time in what became community relations at Marshall Fields, and then was even moved to the Twin Cities and lived there working for Target Corporation for the next 6 years, and working in marketing, learning a tremendous amount. I call it the University of Target. This was the heyday in my mind of the Target years, where the marketing was so incredible. They had democratized design in such an interesting way. And so I always wanted to return to the arts, and my heart is in Chicago. And so when this opportunity came looking for me at the MCA to run the marketing and communications, I decided it was time to come home and move into the nonprofit sector.
And then you were there for several years, and then that led to the Joyce Foundation. Is that right? Or
yeah, it did. I mean, I think at the MCA is when I met my husband and I had my child, and something sort of shifted in me. I had lost my mother when I was working at Target. I lost my father when I was at the MCA. Something shifted in me, and I became this stakeholder in the mission of organizations as opposed to an employee. And the MCA was very interested in diversifying its audiences, was a lot of the conversation at that point. And so I went from running marketing to running communications and community engagement. And I started to be really interested in why audiences in some spaces don't look like the rest of Chicago, why artists that are presented tend to be in the Eurocentric canon, as opposed to really reflecting a diversity, a racial and ethnic diversity in Chicago. And that led me to do a lot of work and organizing that was outside of the parameters of a job. And so that's how I think the Joyce Foundation, the woman who had run the culture program there was Michelle Boone, who is a dear friend and the former commissioner of cultural affairs in Chicago. And so I think that she had been watching my work, and when she left her position to become the commissioner, Joyce approached, and I started to have conversations with them about what would it look like to bring this awareness and consciousness to a private foundation space.
Well, let's talk about the, I want to get to Field in a second, but let's talk about the philanthropic world in Chicago. And particularly for people maybe here in the southern part of the state who are not that familiar, you know, how big is it? What are the major institutions? Are there kind of discrete segments of this community? What does it look like?
Yeah. So in terms of the philanthropic landscape, hands down, the majority of money that is sent out to fund nonprofit organizations come from individuals, actually. And after individuals, it's family foundations. A lot of that is behind the scenes. A lot of folks, you know, are sort of invited to submit proposals. It's not necessarily a transparent philanthropic process. That said, in Chicago in particular, and I think this is different from places around the state, and this is a shift where rural communities are often sort of struggling because they don't have such a wealth of philanthropic resources. But in Chicago, apart from the individuals, high net worth individuals, you have a really robust private philanthropic foundation community. So you have MacArthur, that's based in Chicago and has rolled out a team that focuses on Chicago. You have the Chicago Community Trust that has a really thoughtful approach to focusing on community. You have Field Foundation and Woods Fund and Crossroads. So you have a lot of different philanthropic entities that each have kind of their own focus, their own board, their own process. And you see a lot of dollars that are being funneled in that way that support largely the nonprofit community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so when you came to the Field Foundation in 2016, what niche did it inhabit then, and how have you shifted into a different niche?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to just say one thing before I switch to the story of Field Foundation, which I think is pretty interesting. When I was at the Joyce Foundation, I think one of the things that I was able to do was given a perspective of sort of seeing it 30,000 feet. The Joyce Foundation focuses on policy for the most part, has like a big regional focus as well. And so there are, that's sort of the bird's eye view of what's happening. I think that also there is a tremendous platform and exposure to how philanthropy works. And a lot of what you see is that philanthropic spaces, and this is pretty relevant for what we're talking about today, but for the most part are white spaces. They're led by affluent white folks who have made their way through all the universities, all the right universities. They have boards that are often similar, and they might have program officers that are of different backgrounds and life experiences, but the theories of change that guide philanthropy, the metrics that are used to evaluate whether grants have gone well, the grantee partners that are chosen, it's all part of a larger system that sort of feeds on itself. And I actually think that the opportunity that I had at Joyce, where the board are giants, I have so much admiration for that board of directors, and the staff is incredible to this day. I think it allowed me to, going back to this idea of skepticism, to begin to question the philanthropic space itself, and how as problem solvers, many times we're part of the problem, just in our own design, in our own sort of navel gazing, or in our own way of being so insular and so removed from folks that are most proximate to problems. So I think that's really an important thing to understand, because it is that duality of love and skepticism. Love for the ability to have the privilege to work on problems, to shepherd capital to folks that need it most, and skepticism of those systems that govern that power and resources. That's the space that I was in when the opportunity with the Field Foundation came up. Okay, Field Foundation is this really interesting foundation, and most people have heard of Marshall Fields, and they know the Field Museum. And they probably have heard of Marshall Field, the OG, the original Marshall Field, who created the department stores and created the Field Museum, and also had a huge hand in creating the Art Institute, Shedd Aquarium, Botanic Gardens, Lincoln Park Zoo. Really was a civic architect for creating a space in Chicago where we can not only find commerce, but we could find culture, right? His grandson, Marshall Field III, was a little bit of a rebel in the family. And he is the one who created the Field Foundation. And so it was created in 1940, and this is our 80th anniversary. Right. So I've just done a tremendous amount of research about our founding and read through all of our annual reports. And in our 1962 annual report, we talk about our commitment to racial justice. So there are some things that Marshall Field III, who by the way was the largest financial backer of Saul Alinsky, who is the godfather of community organizing in Chicago, there are certain things that he baked into the DNA of the Field Foundation. One, it's not a family foundation, which was kind of unusual. At the time that the Field Foundation came to be, there were less than 500 foundations in the United States, and many of them were family foundations. He established it as a private, independent foundation, which means there's a lot of transparency around who serves on the board, the process around decision-making, and the grants that are delivered. In the beginning, there were 30% board members, family members on the board, and he filled the board with civic leaders, many of whom were white women. There was an African-American man who was on the board, who was the president of the NAACP at the time. And the funding that was done was around voting rights for African-Americans, sovereignty for Native Americans, helping immigrant communities to adjust and to find self-determination. So in many ways, the focus that we returned to when I started 4 years ago, without even really fully knowing this, was a return to our original roots. So over the course of 80 years, we've had different leaders of the Field Foundation, many of whom have been African-American. There are less than 8% of leaders of foundations that are African-American and folks of color. And so the Field Foundation has really placed an emphasis on that. And when I joined, they were really focused on doing a lot of direct service work, having a lot of trusted site visits with community, and being very responsive to what community needs were. So I started in 2016, which was a year of tremendous gun violence in the city of Chicago. It's actually the second bloodiest year in the history of Chicago. And when I started, the board and the staff were asking themselves a lot of questions around impact. I always do air quotes when I say impact, but how do we have the most impact for our dollars? And it was actually just the perfect moment for us to go on a racial justice journey, which was very much the space that I was coming from, to try to lead an institution to a new space where we would do everything differently on behalf of trying to get different results of the problems we tried to solve. Does that make sense?
It does. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the racial justice training that that you arranged for both the board and the staff, and just how pivotal that was to your kind of sharpened mission.
So when I started, it was July of 2016, and I was really charged with rethinking strategy. We had a board meeting in September where we looked at these different levers within philanthropy, how there's strategic giving, there's responsive giving, there's equitable giving, which at that point and still to this day is kind of an unknown if that is an oxymoron or not. And so the next step was to have a full day retreat where we studied the issues. And that is the framing I used for the racial justice training. I knew coming in that a lot of conversation about race in philanthropy happens at the staff level, but it never moves up to the board level. And so as the staff turns over, those ideas turn over. The Field Foundation to this day is 30% family members. Marshall Field V is one of the most incredible humans that I know, and I feel very lucky that we've been able to work together and actually form a real friendship. He is a board member. He's been on the board for 50 years. And two of his daughters, Jamie and Stephanie, are also on the board. We have 80% folks of color on the board, 75% staff of color. And it felt extremely important that we all get on the same page around racial justice. And racial justice trainings, I say this a lot, they're not just for white people to understand privilege and to understand systemic racism. Racial justice trainings are just as important, if not more, for folks of color to experience, because we have gotten all the same messages, and the design of racism is so fantastic. It's so well designed, it's really hard to recognize sometimes. So we did a racial justice training a month after the last presidential election. I was about 4 or 5 months into the job. And it was a very scary thing to do at that time. Not only because I didn't know my board very well. We are not the choir. We all come at things from a different place. Talking about race in mixed company is very hard to do. We're really scared of offending, and we're really scared of being offended. And so we tend to not go there. And as a woman of color leading a foundation, to actually lead with race felt extremely like a vulnerable thing to do, that people would think that I was pushing my own proclivities instead of being the strategist that they hired me to be. But I knew early on that if we weren't diagnosing the issues that we face, especially in Chicago, correctly, we would never get to solutions that are well designed, and we would never get to this concept of impact. So we did an all-day training. Race Forward came in and did it with us. And, you know, it raised some questions like, what about class? How do, you know, is it about race? Is it about class? These were really important questions to ask, especially in the wake of the last presidential election, where you saw there was so much tension that continues to this day in rural white communities, as opposed to in urban communities of color. And so what we did was we launched a process and a project around heat maps, where we studied the city of Chicago to be able to better answer that question.
And the heat maps showed that there are communities, and particularly in the southern and the western parts, that have, I mean, a kind of a confluence of poor educational opportunities, poor employment opportunities, violence. Almost everything bad tends to concentrate in these communities, and very few opportunities. Is that?
Yes, and the study area was defined by communities that are less than 10% Caucasian in Chicago. And so we drew a red line around that study area. And I think the red line is an incredibly important takeaway, that is the same red line that's been put there years ago by housing policies, followed by education policies and, you know, criminal justice policies, that we're actually creating the outcomes that we designed for. And so until we change the policy pieces, we aren't going to see any other differences.
No, and your kind of reformatted approach, the term you used is community empowerment through justice, art, and leadership investment. Walk through those various concepts and how they are manifested in your day-to-day work.
Sure. And the first thing that I have to say, and I always say this, and I was in that letter, but I do feel like I have to acknowledge that when a foundation says community empowerment, it sounds patronizing, like we can bestow empowerment on the community. But that isn't actually what we mean. We feel like there's a tremendous amount of power in community, whether that's on the southwest side of Chicago or whether that's in rural areas across the state. There just aren't resources there. There's just not the view that these are experts in their own experience, and that resource allocation and design of solutions need to actually be led by folks in these areas, as opposed to those who have no proximity and lived experience with these issues. So we see the city of Chicago as like a localized power grid, where there's all of this power that exists. And so how do we get electricity and capital there? We removed some of the siloed areas, like we don't have a health focus anymore or an education focus, which some places do channel their giving in that way. For us, because we decided to focus on systems, we decided to acknowledge the intersectionality of systemic issues. So justice means that we fund organizers that live in communities where we focus, Southwest Side primarily, some suburbs, to design their own solutions. It's community design of community wealth and community wellness. That's justice. It's organizers. Art interrogates the notion of what gets to be called art. If you look at where 501c3 arts organizations are in Chicago, and this is part of the heat map, you see that only 13% of them are on the south and west sides. But if you pull where the copyrights for music licenses are held, they're all over the south and west sides. Like, people are creating music in their homes. People don't organize themselves necessarily as a 501c3. And the art doesn't feel separate from what an organization does. So you have arts happening in health spaces, you have for-profit art entities, you have individual artists, you have collectives. That's how art and that's how social impact organizes itself. And so we're trying to do better and find it and fund it. Leadership investment, we started giving money directly to people. And so when I talk about how Chicagoans merit our support, we're trying to match that ethos with our dollars. So we have a program called Leaders for a New Chicago that we do in partnership with the MacArthur Foundation. And these are $50,000 awards that go to visionaries that are organizers and journalists and media makers, storytellers, artists, leading nonprofits. $25,000 is for them directly and $25,000 is for their organization. And we've since launched a new program on media and storytelling. Journalism is under fire lately, and the concept of fake news is talked about a lot. In communities of color, there's always been a belief that there's fake news, that the news doesn't reflect us, that it isn't, the stories are told about us and not by us. And so we're making a concerted effort to fund podcasters and newspaper outlets and radio shows and web series that are really about communities of color telling their own stories.
Well, Angelique, you have a wonderful white paper about storytelling, and make kind of a distinction between media and storytelling and how they relate, and then also how they're different.
Yeah, so media and storytelling relate because they're both fact-based narratives, but media uses outlets that are more traditional, like a newspaper or a radio outlet. Storytelling is actually how a lot of us are getting our news these days. And so that's where you see documentaries, that's where you see podcasts, that's where you see web series. And it actually, in many cases, is less expensive to create storytelling vehicles. And so we're seeing an explosion of really innovative storytelling that's happening right now that could be the next iteration of what journalism looks like. And so we feel like it's important to support the legacy approach to media, but also to support the way that we're actually processing information these days. But the fact-based piece of it is the connective tissue.
Okay. One of the metaphors you use in one of your essays was the babies in the water. And why don't you tease that out about, because I guess it goes to the whole notion of making systemic changes and going to the root of problems.
Yes. That's actually how I opened the racial justice training, was with this parable of the babies in the river. And so a person is walking along a river, and all of a sudden a baby comes floating down. And so alarmed, the person naturally jumps into the river to save the baby, just as another baby comes floating down, and another and another. And eventually the person has to set up spaces to house and clothe and educate and nourish the babies. And all the while, babies are streaming down the river. And there's never a chance to travel upstream to figure out where the babies are coming from. So it's a parable, and it's an analogy that is about the difference between charity and social change. And for us, it was also about understanding philanthropy, where if you're funding on the banks of the river, you're funding in direct service. You're funding in immediate needs. COVID rapid response funds, which I'm honored to be a part of, we are at the banks of the river. We are trying to save as many lives as possible. But when I started, the board was asking a lot of questions about our funding, which was being done at the banks of the river. And the questions were things like, how has violence decreased in the city of Chicago because of our dollars? And so what we had to understand is that that's the wrong question when you fund at the banks of the river. If you need to answer that question, or you want to, you must travel upstream. And that's the Public Policy Institute. That's what you focus on. Upstream, what is the chess game? What are the pieces that are being put in place that will always create the need to have folks on the banks of the river. So either we had to ask ourselves better questions, or we had to change ourselves and change our funding and move upstream to get at root causes.
Angelique, in terms of the conversation on race, I mean, you just said how difficult it is and how people are so worried about offending and being offended. And I think at one point you said, you know, we're all trying to avoid the obvious traps that await everyone when the conversation turns to race. What is the solution? Just plunge ahead and do your best? Or, I mean, how do you encourage people to have this conversation in a way that's meaningful?
You know, I think one of the most encouraging things that's happening right now, at least what gives me hope, is there is this sort of moment of awakening around race and racism, not everywhere. Some are resisting it, but I am watching uprisings that are happening in different countries where people are actually using terminology around anti-racism, understanding that we have to fight the anti-Blackness that's happening, using terms like racial equity inside of corporations. So I think that this is like a moment where people are really grappling with the language and what it means. One of our partners at the Impact House, our co-working space with other foundations that we created, is the Chicago Public Library Foundation. And the woman who runs it, Brenda, said that the reading list is so long for anti-racism resources, which I think is a good way to begin. You know, I think understanding that there's a lot you don't understand is always the best place to start. There are tremendous books that have been written, and so beginning to educate yourself, and I think having a space of humility where you understand also that, you know, you may not see white privilege if you are a white person, because that's how white privilege works. Like that's it, pretty much. And so understanding first that there's a lot to learn. Then there's so many resources where people can come together for trainings. I mentioned Race Forward. There's a group that I'm proud to have co-founded called Enrich Chicago that does regularized anti-racism trainings and then also leads cohorts to start to work through. But the process is a lifelong process. I'm still learning that process. I'm still making mistakes. You just have to be brave enough to move forward and understand the caste system that we live in will not change unless we each do our part to change it.
In one of our forefront board meetings, you had made a comment, this was maybe in March or April, about the two pandemics that had gripped the United States, you know, COVID and then the race. What is the state of these pandemics? Are they easing? I mean, obviously we watch the public health and it's hard to say COVID is easing, but when you talked about the racial issue, it seems like there is a more frank conversation going on, but of course, one worries, is this just a transitory moment? So where do things stand in these two pandemics?
Yes. Thank you for listening to me in a board meeting. That's encouraging. I do believe that this is a dual pandemic, and in many ways, people have settled in to quarantine, those that are privileged enough to not be healthcare workers or essential workers and needing to go and be out of their homes. In some ways, people have settled into that life. And we're at this critical moment with the other part, the other pandemic, which is the pandemic of racism. COVID has actually, it's like a black light, which exposed all of these inequities that you and I talked about and that our heat maps show. I think that the videos that we collectively watched, and maybe it was the fact that we were in quarantine, so many of us, that we as a nation and as a world watched the calm lynching of George Floyd on video and watched as others stood by and allowed it to happen. I think that the combo, the 1-2 punch of that video with the Amy Cooper video, showing how privilege is actually exercised and used, how you can call in a hit on Blackness, I think that created this charge where people felt a range of things. And I was talking at that forefront meeting about feeling deflated, feeling at turns overcome and overwhelmed, coupled with this intensity that the door has creaked open for massive change. The uprisings that we're seeing, they signal a plate tectonic shift. And we all hold the ability to actually turn to our institutes and turn to our foundations and enact change. But our muscle memory is of inequity. That's where our comfort level is. And so I think that this is a critical period. These next couple months will define what the next 100 years will look like for Chicago, for Illinois, for our country. Will we be able to actually make these seismic shifts in how we operate? Equity means shifting power, shifting resources. Will we shift our own power in our institutions? Will we operate differently? Will we make a long-term commitment to locally sourced power? Will we invite folks in that never get a seat at the table to lead? And will we listen? These are the questions that will define us and define the world for our children and grandchildren.
I mean, how do you think you'll be able to read whether this moment is being seized upon? What are some of the indications, kind of tangible indications, that things really are changing?
One of the things that I think is so interesting, and you mentioned, when we were chatting prior about your wife as an actor and how theater has changed so radically. One of the things I think is so interesting is to watch the takedown of so many of these large cultural institutions that's happening in mass, from theaters to museums to, symphonies and ballets. What you're seeing is that people who are employees of those spaces or artists themselves are calling out institutions. So power is shifting already. It's not the wealthiest donor that's dictating how things will go. It's the lowest paid person. It is the artist, as always, that leads the revolution, but that's saying, here is how, well, maybe not saying yet, here's how we need to shift, but saying there is a problem. The canary in the coal mine, there is a problem. And so we are in this period. How will we know if we make change? It will be about the process of the rebuild, not just the product of what lands. Equity is bringing different voices into the table wherever you are and having that be a part of the redesign. It's shifting narrative over who gets to be the expert. It's long-term shifts of investment. Who makes decisions on investments? Where are you investing your dollars? Those are the tells. And now you have so many institutions who have sent out their racial equity statement. I've kept them. I've got Sephora's, I have, Nike's, I have nonprofits, I have foundations. And so you have now committed to working on shifting power and resources. The other part of equity is accountability. So now we will hold each other lovingly and critically accountable for what we've said.
As you look ahead, give us the best case scenario of the next, you say several months, but, moving on to a couple of years. I mean, how can we come out of this dual crisis in a much better place than where we started in March?
Yeah, I believe that the brightest, most innovative, futurist ideas of the renewal are actually old ideas, indigenous ideas. We're in a space right now where we are educating our own children. We are adjunct faculty in their lives. That's a beautiful thing, actually, and that's going to continue for a long period of time. And so figuring out, how do we pull that forward so that we always function that way? How do we pull forward all the community gardening that's happening? How do we pull forward the fact that we're checking on our neighbors who are elderly? How do we actually take these community mutual aid processes and move them forward? And frankly, that is what, there are certain terms that might shock people or scare them as we start to move into a debate around, say, defunding police or an abolitionist framework. Those things sound like we're talking about slashing things, but actually what's being discussed is this community abundance model, where more resources are putting into community so that we can carefully and lovingly cultivate each other, develop each other. I think if we are going to move to surviving and thriving from this dual pandemic, it will completely be focused on hyper-local cultivation of self and other. I've talked about these pandemics as highlighting how symbiotic we are in nature. If you are not well in Carbondale, then I am not well in Chicago. If I'm not thriving in Chicago, then you're not thriving in Carbondale. So how do we actually just live our lives that way, that we are interdependent and that we need each other to do well and to survive and thrive ourselves. So I see that as the big futurist idea.
Great. Well, let's turn to a couple of questions, Angelique, if it works for you. The first one, and it actually relates to this kind of nicely, it's Matt from Bloomington, who wants to know, has the Field Foundation ever funded projects outside of Chicago? Obviously, there's enough big challenges in Chicago. Yours called the Field Foundation of Illinois, which I know kind of distinguishes from the sister organization in New York. But tell us about your remit. Does it focus real tightly on Chicago, or does it extend to the rest of the state?
Yeah, so the Field Foundation of Illinois, like you said, it was actually created, that title was created in 1965 when a Field Foundation of New York was created. And that has to do with like a Marshall Field III passing away and the assets being divided. Field Foundation of New York sunset after 20 years. And so the Field Foundation of Illinois sometimes throughout the history has funded throughout the state. In the last 4 years, we've focused on Chicago, in particular the south and west sides, but we've started to actually move out in terms of geography, understanding the suburbanization of poverty, also understanding the mass migration of folks of color across to different places. So that our main focus is south and west sides of Chicago, but some of the suburbs as well.
Okay. Alan from Sacramento asked, has the pandemic altered the foundation's future priorities, and if so, how?
Actually, the pandemic, I think, in many ways, we've been training up for it through our priorities. I think that it really underscored why a focus on race and racial justice is so critical, why narrative change and organizers and artists are so important. The only shift I would say is that, the board decided to put more dollars this coming year in a rapid response fund so that we could be more proactive in trying to meet needs. We have no idea what's coming in a month or in 6 months. So,
right. Sharon from Kenosha, Wisconsin wants to ask, please give us some examples of what the new normal will look like from a micro and macro perspective.
The new normal. I mean, I think that we're living in a new normal right now. There's 42 million people that are out of work. And so from, a micro perspective, I think that we're going to have a lot of folks that are trying to figure out as stimulus packages end, as we track where the dollars have gone and not gone, we're going to have a lot of folks that are trying to figure out how to feed their families. We have a lot of children that are at home, that are not in camps, that require childcare. And so we're having, on a very micro level, we are having a lot of trauma that is surfacing. There's a lot of need for cash and for dollars. And there's an increasing opportunity to figure out new industries at the same time. On a micro level, our economy, a macro level, our economy has been in a shift for some time. We've seen this sort of hollowing out of the middle class that's been happening. And we know that certain industries were starting to go away in general. And so I think we're going to see a speed up of that shift into the technology, the digital economy. We've already seen it through how you and I are in conversation and how we've been doing our board meetings. And that's going to create a tremendous new opportunity for jobs. Healthcare is going to create new opportunity for jobs. Treating trauma is a new opportunity for jobs. And so I think that it's not like necessarily just a dark story of tragedy and things ending. We're kind of in this opportunity where we're going to see an economic turnover of how we function and how we make money. We're going to see that in the next year.
Nancy from Marion wants to know, hopefully this isn't too personal a question. She said, if you were not president of a foundation, what would you be doing? You seem so talented.
My gosh, thank you so much for saying that. I don't know what I would be doing. I have to say, I've loved every job that I've ever had. I loved being a waitress. That was one of my favorite jobs. I felt like the tip was my applause. I loved being a bartender. I've loved being an assistant sometimes, not always, but I did. I know my assistant is watching and she's probably like, it's not this great job. I love working in nonprofits. Actually, I feel like so connected to the mission. And so I have no idea what comes next after this, or if it's even smart to stay in philanthropy. You know, philanthropy is a head trip. You're associated with money, you are a conduit to cash, and you're assigned a lot of power. And so in some ways I worry the longer you stay in this space, the more you believe your own hype. I have no idea what's next. I think my favorite jobs are being a mom and being a wife. And so who knows? But thank you for saying that. You just made my day.
Okay. Well, Angelique, as we close down, you and I had talked about books, and I had asked you to. I told you about some of the books that our friends have sent us have kind of shaped their view of Illinois, and I asked you to suggest some books that would maybe help some of us who have not spent that much time in Chicago better understand your city. And you gave me some great titles. Do you have them in front of you, or do you want me to walk through them? And
no, I have them, but I have to tell you, John, I should have told you this before, but it was such a cool question that you asked. And so I took to Facebook and I said, you know, I've been questioned, what is the quintessential book that explains Chicago? What would you say to that? Here's some of my thoughts. And I must have 100 comments on my Facebook page with some of the most incredible books. And so I'm not going to do it justice, but I looked through what others had suggested. And so thumbs up on anything by Gwendolyn Brooks, on Richard Wright, on Natalie Moore, Southside, Jungle from Upton Sinclair, Boss. So many people said Boss. Harold Washington, A Raisin in the Sun. So there's like a million things that I just had to give a shout out to because so many people gave their ideas. But mine, there's a woman named Eve Ewing. If you don't know Eve, you really should. She's a poet and writer, and she wrote a book on 1919. Have you read it, John, by any chance?
I have not, no.
So good. Maybe I'll send it to you. And it's about the race riots, the Red Summer, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, education policy. Avery R. Young is a visual artist, performer, poet. He wrote Neckbone. That's my second one. My third one, Sandra Cisneros, House on Mango Street. It's a wonderful year of a girl's life. Oh, you told me no plots, but it's a really wonderful story. Adam Langer, Crossing California, which is really about the importance of streets in Chicago and how they divide in terms of class. And then the final one is from my dad, and I have it right here. It's Chicago, From the Depression to the Millennium, A Black Perspective. My dad wrote a book, and it's his essays, and so that rounds out my list.
Well, tell us about your dad's book. I mean, what was it's a series of essays about various aspects of Chicago, or a biographical sketch, or how did he develop that theme?
Yeah, so when he and my mom retired, they started to do all kinds of stuff like bridge clubs, and they took a writing class for senior citizens that was held at the Chicago Cultural Center. And this book is a result of that. It's a series of essays. They are from a personal perspective, from being a police officer during the 1968 Democratic Convention, a Black police officer. That's one of the essays that he writes about. And he also talks about things like, he has an essay about alleys in Chicago and their importance, especially in the 20th century, in terms of being a space of commerce and what that looked like in particular in Black communities. So it's a lovely piece of wisdom, and he's a funny person, so you can hear his voice throughout.
And he must have been very proud to when that came out, and brandished it to friends and family and all.
He traveled with a box in his trunk. He would sell them sometimes, but he would mostly give them away.
Great. Good. Well, Angelique, thank you so much for really a wonderful and interesting and stimulating conversation. We'll definitely stay in touch. I look forward to seeing you at board meetings. And we also want to get you down to Carbondale, see the other end of the state, and kind of have a chance to connect our two communities. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We'll have this on YouTube in a day or so. And thank you again so much. And your support has helped keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you.